like to talk a little bit comparing the street art and the graffiti, because we just finished a graffiti unit, and I gave you a lot of information, and I'm sorry if I'm annoying you by giving you too much information. And there goes my cat. But there's just so much to tell you, and we really even haven't had a chance to get into detail by a lot of the artists. I just want to talk about the comparison of street art versus graffiti, because this is really important, because we didn't have the opportunity to physically go to Graffiti Alley and just see how much street art has affected and changed Graffiti Alley. I want to sort of talk about the important distinction between street art and graffiti, because there is a huge one. People seem to use the terms interchangeably, which is really annoying. So our second lesson then, we're talking about street art versus graffiti. So let's just have a look at what is street art and the differences between the two. Okay, so just give me a second here. We'll see if my cat walks past again. Okay, so let's look at a difference between the two. And again, particularly, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about some of the key players in street art, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the artists in Toronto. So here is a perfect example of street art versus graffiti. So on the right-hand side here is a bunch of, graffiti. And this is sort of street art, and the idea of both of them sort of battling for space in the public space on the walls, because they do have a shared history. So both street art and graffiti sort of started because of the invention of spray paint, right? And that's kind of where all they have in common. Well, they have spray paint, and they both paint in public space, right? On the walls in the cities. And that's pretty much it. Some artists are both graffiti writers and street artists, and they kind of go back and forth. But generally, you're a graffiti artist or you're a street artist, and both of them have very different sort of missions and purposes. So street art kind of diverge, where they diverge is sort of the idea of advertising from the 50s. The idea of a lot of street artists kind of started off, or the training was sort of in academic art schools or advertisements or illustrations. So you'll see like a lot of these street artists can do a bunch of different things. Not only do they put their art in public spaces on walls using spray paint, but also a lot of them have academic backgrounds where they went to like art school, or on the side they do illustrations as well, or also they do a bunch of other different sorts of things, right, where they also show in galleries and things like that. So the idea of stencils, for example, and using those, in the streets, using spray paint, comes very much from the 1950s, from silkscreen printing. This is before like really good printers, were invented, and so a lot of advertisements and stuff were printed either by hand or in this way, where very solid blocks of color, right, with each color would be printed separately. So in the 1950s, one of the leading artists from this was Andy Warhol, who was a graphic designer, and he did a lot of like advertisements, and that's how he started off his careers. And then what happened for his career, he kind of went from like the everyday sort of practical art artist to like a professional artist, like in galleries, and that crossover, right? So he started using his graphic design skills and actually creating like pieces of art. So Andy Warhol became really well known, and he kind of using that same technique of silkscreen printing that they did for advertisements, he used it and crossed over to the fine art world, right? And he did everyday items printed like the same way advertisements were made, but he put them in art galleries. And so that's pretty huge, right? This bringing the everyday thing to, the high fine art area is very rebellious of him. So it really changed, the scope of where art was going. He even took things like car crashes, which is crazy. He took things that we saw in the newspaper, if you knew what those are, that people would see every day in the newspaper, these photographs, and like these in the news, when you turn the news on, all you see these awful, like, people getting shot and car crashes and these horrible scenes. And he took those images that everyday people are seeing all the time at night, from the news, and he printed them in different colors and made them into fine art, and people started to buy them because they matched the couch, and the really odd sort of collecting of images, but these are just reflecting our everyday lives and what we see all the time, right? So, and then something else that he did was he took images from popular culture, particularly celebrities, from from advertisements, and they weren't very high quality reproductions because of sort of the printing abilities of newspapers and stuff at the time. And he used the silkscreen process and created these really brightly colored images of these popular icons of the day, right? And quite often sometimes he changed, the color of the face, and they'd have a blue face and pink hair and etc., right? So that's Andy Warhol. So taking that technique from advertisements and this academic sort of way of doing art, and changing the rules a little bit, and using those to create art and to mass produce things. So we invent things like stencils and bright colors, and so this naturally led to sort of street art that we see now with the combination of spray paint. So in my opinion, it's like when graffiti art sort of meets pop art. So in France in the 1980s, there was a guy named Blek, and he is called known as the father of stencil graffiti, and he started creating these black and white life-size images of human beings, and they would be placed in certain places on the street. And he also used that repetitive motif of like the rat, and the rat sort of symbolized like this, it lives in cities, and it's just got diseases, and they reproduce really quickly, and that could be a metaphor for so many things in cities, like homeless people that you don't want to see, and they're sort of like rats, and sort of, and I'm not saying that that's true, I'm just saying that that's sort of like how some people sort of view them, and sort of, so he started using these themes and these people, and it started to make sort of these comments on society by using these images and placing them in certain places. So, but he would prepare these big stencils at home and then bring them up at night, and using spray paint, put them on the streets. Now, in the 1990s in London, one of the most famous street artists is Banksy, and there's lots of stuff that he has done, and you might have recently seen something a couple of years ago where he actually had one of his most famous pieces, and it was up for auction, and then it went for tons of money. I can't even remember how much it went. And then, and it was in this big gold frame, and as it's getting auctioned off, and it was sold. All of a sudden, the painting, the piece of art is on paper, and it starts going through this frame and starts getting shredded, and it stopped like halfway, right? So he was always doing these really neat tricks. Now works very similar to Blek, and there's some arguments that he sort of stole the way that Blek works, but Banksy, what he does is very smart, and we could go on forever about Banksy. He's very cool, but he does a lot of really neat things about, again, these black and white images of these stencils of these people, and these neat comments about society, and depending where they are and how they're placed, what kind of stories they're telling you, and making you think about the world and society and things like that. Now, in the 1990s in the United States came this guy Shephard, Fairey, and you've probably seen this. This is the Obey guy, and he's got a clothing line out now, and he took a lot of these things, the ideas of a silkscreen printing, like making stencils and taking images from newspapers and reproducing them and changing them, just like Andy Warhol did. And he did this with Andre the Giant, and he made this Andre the Giant's face, the idea that it's this really deep staring at you, telling you to obey, and he's putting these stickers all over the place and these posters up all over the place, and people are starting to question, like, what does this mean? And he's not necessarily spelling it all out, telling them exactly what it is, but he's telling you to obey, and then you're like, why do I have to obey? Right? Question authority, maybe think for myself, and don't pay attention to what advertisements telling me that I need to always do things and be my own person. And that's sort of his message, but he's putting it out in the public, out there, right? To start these conversations, so people start to create these own meanings, with his art. Another really cool artist from New York in the 2000s, one of my favorite ones is Swoon, and she does some really neat stuff where she actually, I don't know if you've ever done lino cut before. When you might have done this maybe in elementary school, where you're carving out a block and you're rolling out with ink and then you're stamping it and you're printing it. Well, she does these huge ones of these people, and she tells different stories of different types of people, and then so she does it on paper and then she puts them up on walls, like it's called wheat paste, and it's kind of like a glue that you put up, and so they go different places around the city, and it's telling different stories about different types of people and their lives. And again, bringing awareness to so many different issues that we may not be aware of all the time because we're so focused on our own lives. So she does some really neat stuff that way, and giving her characters and these people that she focuses on a certain type of voice. So those are just, some things really super briefly about sort of street art. And so we know that graffiti is all like word-based, and street art is more image-based. It's you're getting meaning by looking at these images. So graffiti is anonymous, and street art is anonymous too, but quite often we know people's real names because it's not only because they are also doing other jobs as artists in galleries, or because they are also illustrators, because sometimes they're muralists and they get paid and commissioned to do some of these pieces. Quite often we know what their real names are, right? Because they want to get hired, they want you to know who they are, and they want to get, contacted. So true graffiti is always illegal, right? Sometimes, of course we have legal graffiti walls, and so it can be legal sometimes, but street art, can be illegal, but quite often it's more legal, and this is now, not always and not everywhere, but quite often now street art is getting commissioned, and people tend to pay for street artists to paint on their walls more than graffiti artists, because it seems to be more for the whole public, right? So remember, graffiti is just a language meant for other graffiti writers, and street art is meant for the public. Graffiti, it tends to be more self-taught, or you learn from other graffiti writers. Not always, but most of the time, but that's how you learn, so to learn on the streets from other people. Street art tends to be, and not always, but they tend to have more formal training. They tend to go to art school, and then they use those skills, and they decide that they want to go paint on some walls. So graffiti is a personal brand, right? It's egotistical. There's my cat again, right? Where street art is meant for the public, and graffiti, people don't know what it is, and they don't understand it, right? It's not meant for the public, so it's unrelatable for them. So street art seems to be more accepted and more relatable. So why this matters is now in places like Graffiti Alley, there's this competition for a public space. So whether it's a legal graffiti wall or place or not, or even getting commissioned for certain things, there's this competition for space. Now, so this is a picture of Graffiti Alley from last year when we went there. And Graffiti Alley started off from graffiti artists, and it wasn't always legal. Graffiti writers were painting there all the time, and a lot of them got arrested for this. And then eventually, it became a legal place, and it's a tourist attraction, but a lot of people a lot of graffiti writers sort of had to pay their dues and pay with getting criminal records and arrested to make this a legal place, right? And then all of a sudden in walk these street artists, and they start painting over top of all of these graffiti places. And then, but this is an alley, but there's still, there's still the back of businesses that are owned by people. So people, the owners are starting to commission people to come and actually paint the whole buildings or certain sections. And who they're commissioning are these graffiti or these street artists. So what's happening now is when you go down Graffiti Alley, every time there's less and less graffiti and more street art. So street artists are kind of coming in and taking over and getting paid, and they didn't have, to do their work. It's They didn't have to, suffer and go through all the illegal parts and get arrested and everything to get it where it is now, so it's kind of taking over. And you can imagine that fight for space is really, making graffiti artists mad. So you can, and unfortunately, like, I've known there's some really great graffiti pieces that were there for a long time, and now they've been covered up for street artists. So it's completely changing the way that Graffiti Alley is. And the biggest problem is that people go to Graffiti Alley and they see this street art that has no words in it. It's just images, right? And they say, oh, that's a graffiti artist. That's a graffiti artist. So Banksy, one of the most famous street artists in the world right now, everywhere you look in the newspaper, and every time he does something, and every time that anything's advertised for him, people they call him a graffiti artist, but he's not a graffiti artist at all. So in fact, in a way, graffiti is actually losing its meaning, and they're using those terms interchangeably. So that's why it's important. That's why I'm spending a little bit of extra time explaining the difference between graffiti and street art, because there are big differences, even though they both use spray paint and they're just on the street. Okay, so let's start making our own street art.